And while we're switching over, there we go. I just want to reiterate thanks to everyone for joining today. For those of you that aren't familiar with me, my name is John Hadley. I'm a staff member for the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, and I serve as the staff lead for the Dolphin and Wahoo Fishery Management Plan. And so just wanted to kick it off here today for the presentation and, overall this really great collaborative research effort that's been conducted in the region on the dolphin and wahoo fisheries, which are quite the fisheries in the region, but as we'll get into in a little bit, function very differently depending on which area is examined. But really what I'm going to do today is provide a little bit of background information, context in general, and then an overview of the participatory workshops. Next slide, please. And so as a little bit of background and to provide a little context on the research that was conducted, for those of you that aren't familiar, the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council manages dolphin and wahoo along the entire U.S. Atlantic coast. So the management unit really runs from Maine all the way through Key West, Florida, and the entire U.S. Exclusive Economic Zone in between. The South Atlantic Council is the primary council in charge of managing dolphin and wahoo. However, manages it in conjunction with liaisons from the Mid-Atlantic Fishery Management Council as well as the New England Fishery Management Council. And in general, there's been a great deal of public comment, both on the record through comments directly to the council, as well as just speaking with fishermen, speaking with AP members, and just feedback in general that there are really different perceptions of the fishery, and particularly of the dolphin fishery and the status of the dolphin fishery. There's some very divergent views on the fishery, specifically in the North Carolina Outer Banks region, compared to South Florida and say the Florida Keys. So, given these different regional perceptions, that was one of the reasons that this research was taken on. Additionally, there has been an increased focus on dolphin and wahoo management on the council level. And really, the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council, again, managing in partnership with the Mid-Atlantic Council and the New England Council, is at a nexus of management decisions in the Dolphin Wahoo Fishery Management Plan. Overall, the council has been working for quite a while very hard on Dolphin Wahoo Amendment 10, so Amendment 10 to the Dolphin Wahoo Fishery Management Plan, that includes several different management revisions, including looking at changing retention limits for both dolphin and wahoo. Additionally, the council is going to be wrapping up, or is scheduled to potentially wrap up, Amendment 10 through a vote of final approval at their June 2021 meeting, making this research very timely. In addition to that, the council has also indicated that they're interested in examining potential changes to the commercial pelagic longline fishery, as well and that's on the commercial side, of course, and then on the recreational side, examining a change in the dolphin size limit, potentially changing the size limit itself or changing the range for which it applies, as well as considering different retention limits on board private vessels versus for hire vessels. So the council is essentially wrapping up one amendment to the FMP and considering their next amendment moving forward, making this very timely. And last but not least is that the species, both dolphin and wahoo, support very important fisheries. However, there are really some data limitations for both species. In general, there's research conducted on the two species, but they're not a highly migratory managed species, HMS managed species, but they do exhibit habits of being very highly migratory, meaning that they migrate into different management jurisdictions quite often. Also, there's just limited data in general on the status of the stocks. There's no formal stock assessment for either species, and really there's no, so there isn't, and those are really due to data limitations. So given the data limitations, the nexus of management decisions, and the general importance of the two fisheries, that's really what led to the following research, which we'll get into in just a few minutes. Next slide, please. And as a general overview of the workshop that were conducted, the goal was to increase communication between scientists, managers, and really information flowing from fishermen to scientists and managers to get a better understanding of the dolphin wahoo fishery in the Atlantic. These workshops were held in the North Carolina and Virginia area, and then also due to issues over the timeliness of in relation to COVID-19, similar workshops could not be conducted in South Florida and the Florida Keys. However, information was collected from fishermen in South Florida and the Florida Keys through a series of interviews and a webinar. So really the focus was on those two regions in order to map a system of the key factors that affect the fishery. So looking at socioeconomic, physical, and biological aspects of the fishery, identify major concerns and objectives of the fishery, and then also develop hypotheses on how changes in the system may be affecting the fishery and related businesses and communities that rely on those fisheries. Identify key questions and information gaps. In general, this was a collaborative effort that was brought on by Dr. Mandy Karnauskas and Dr. Matt McPherson. They are both with the Southeast Fisheries Science Center, and I will be turning this presentation over to them in just a little bit. But they were really the two leads on this research effort, and were integral and really key to the research being brought forward and completed. To a lesser extent, Julia Bird with the on the South Atlantic Fishery Management Council staff, as well as myself, we provided backup support to this research, help with collaboration amongst the researchers and fishermen and participants that provided input on their observations of the dolphin and wahoo fishery. Certainly, there was much needed support provided by MREP and the Gulf of Maine Research Institute through funding for the participatory workshops. And certainly, last but not least, at all was all of the fishermen and the community participants that really set aside time out of their personal schedules, out of their work schedules, to come to these participatory workshops or attend or were willing to be interviewed and provide information on what they're seeing that is going on in the fisheries for dolphin and wahoo and observations over the years. So that was really an integral part of the research that was conducted. And without further ado, I will hand it over to Mandy and Matt.
Okay, thanks, John. I'm assuming you can hear me out there. My name is Matt McPherson. I lead the social science research group at the Southeast Fisheries Science Center. And as John mentioned, our plans originally were to conduct a series of workshops in person with a set of workshops up in the North Carolina, Virginia area, and then another set of workshops in South Florida. However, as the photo at the bottom of this slide illustrates, we've experienced changing times, so we had to be flexible. We were able to conduct 3 workshops in North Carolina, Virginia, one on March 9th in Beaufort, North Carolina with 7 participants, one in Wanchese, North Carolina with on March 10th with 14 participants, and one in Virginia Beach, Virginia with 4 participants on March 11th. That was a few days before I think the first lockdown occurred for COVID. I basically remember coming back to the office and shutting things down right after that workshop took place. And we waited patiently, hoping that we would be able to actually conduct in-person workshops in South Florida. But finally, we determined that that wasn't going to be feasible, and we wanted to move ahead. So we conducted one-on-one phone calls, Mandy and I, with for-hire and private recreational fishermen. We conducted 12 interviews by phone, and we used those interviews to create conceptual models that I'm going to show you in a minute. And then once that conceptual model was put together, we had a group webinar on April 12th of this year with 9 participants to go over the model, to make corrections, to make sure we had interpreted things correctly. Next slide, please. So just to talk a little bit about what a conceptual model is. A conceptual model is basically a representation of a system that demonstrates the perceptions of what the major components, drivers of the system are, and how they're interrelated. And so besides the model as an output of these workshops, it's really the process of developing the conceptual model that's interesting, because it allows us to learn from fishermen by discussing in great depth what they feel are the most important components in the system and how they are connected to and impact the system. So we not only develop the model, but we take detailed notes from our discussions that we later go back to when analyzing the results. It's important to note in this process that in these workshops, when we had a number of managers and scientists that participated in the workshops, but they were instructed to participate basically only as observers, or they could ask questions. But really what we were interested in is learning from the fishermen in this process. So the model, comes from the participants. We just facilitate it, ask questions. Does this go here? Is this connected to this? Is there anything missing? That sort of thing. And so at the end of this process, when we do these things in person, this is what the conceptual model looks like. And you can see that we use Post-it notes that we can easily add, remove and move around as the discussion moves forward. The workshops in person took about 3/4 of a workday. In this representation, you can see the arrows that are drawn that indicate, the different relationships between the components. Next slide, please. So this is what the conceptual model looks like when it's cleaned up. And you can see that the models, include physical, biological, sociocultural, or socioeconomic, population dynamics, and regulatory components. So in this way, we're able to get a more holistic vision of the system and, include both the interrelationship between the human and sort of non-human factors in the system. Next slide, please. So the other thing that we were able to do in the in-person workshops is we were able to ask participants to do some graphs. I guess we could call it participatory graphing. And so we asked them to draw out things like, annual variation of catch, abundance, their perception of abundance trends over time for Dolphin and Wahoo. And these were done to add further insight to key issues that we discussed in the development of the conceptual model. So you can see here, 2 plots that were done, by participants. One participant plotted the importance of different species to their fishing operations throughout the year. And over on the right, participants plotted their perceived local abundance trends over time for Dolphin, Wahoo, and other species. And so we're going to show, more how these graphs were used later on in the presentation. Next slide. So in the rest of the presentation, we're going to discuss, the results of the workshops that we held. And the presentation, first we're going to discuss the model structure and overall population trends. We're going to provide a summary of the North Carolina and Virginia results, looking a little bit in more detail at the conceptual models that we did there. We're going to do the same thing for South Florida. And then I'm going to turn this over to Mandy, and she's going to talk about, how we're exploring some key questions and hypotheses that have, emerged from this process. And then we're going to provide some conclusions. And just, for a couple caveats, you know, the results represent workshop participant perspectives, so it's not, you know, it's not known truths per se, but these are things that we take for, you know, for further research. And the perspectives, you know, that we talk about are regionally specific, which is actually, you know, particularly of particular interest in terms of how perspectives, you know, differ, I guess, at the regional and sort of sub-regional level. Next slide, please. So all of the models ended up having more or less a similar structure. Even though we did them independently, the models ended up, you know, being focused primarily on the local abundance of dolphin. Although Wahoo abundance was supposed to be one of the focus areas of the workshops, it ended up being more a marginal topic, as you can see it kind of dangling over to the left there. You know, most participants, not all, but most in the workshops and interviews wanted to focus primarily on dolphin, or that's the fishery they had the most experience with. So you can see sort of on the right-hand side of this real generalized model, we have socioeconomic drivers and themes, you know, like local private recreational effort, local charter effort, local and foreign commercial fishing, the commercial sector. And then on the left, we have the physical biological drivers or themes, you know, Atlantic dolphin stock abundance, migratory patterns, habitat features and areas of the distribution of the fish. But although these were all sort of themes that were included in all of the models, it needs to be pointed out that the amount of discussion and the level of emphasis on the theme and the components that were included, you know, sort of under each theme within each model varied sometimes very considerably, you know, depending on subregion, and we'll show, you'll be able to see that a little bit below. Next slide, please. So before we discuss the results from the different subregions and tease out a few things from the conceptual models, I just want to point out some of the perceived abundance trends, and this uses those participatory graphs that I was mentioning before. So the observations in the workshops were largely attuned to local abundance. The participants really, both in the workshops and in the interviews, I would say, had more questions than answers about the overall abundance of the Atlantic dolphin and wahoo stocks. The graph on the top right summarizes the population abundance trends for dolphin and wahoo that were made participants at the Beaufort workshop. So you can see that's taking all those hand-drawn graphs and then plotting them all onto one graph. And as you can see, in that workshop, they reported a gradual decrease in local population abundance for dolphin over time and an increase in perceived wahoo population. Similarly, in Virginia Beach, participants did not report any perceived change in local dolphin or wahoo abundance. But things were dramatically different in the interviews that we conducted in South Florida and the Florida Keys, where most fishermen expressed the perception that the dolphin population in particular has experienced a major decrease in both abundance and in the size of the fish. And this is fairly recent, starting sometime in the last 5 to 10 years. But they also don't report any perceived change in the overall wahoo population. Next slide. So I'm now going to present some more results from the North Carolina, Virginia workshops. Next slide. And as I mentioned before, we're going to break out that large model that I showed you before into pieces so we can focus in on a few themes and a few things that we learned from the modeling. So we start with the commercial fisheries part of the conceptual model, and we actually, for this one, have combined the first and second order linkages for the commercial fishery components for all of the three workshops that we conducted, you know, in Beaufort, Wanchese, and Virginia Beach. So those three models have been combined into this submodel, I guess, focused on the commercial fishery. And if we look at the specific components in the model, we can see that there are the perceptions of the major drivers within this subcomponent of the system and the relationships between these. So I'm going to go through a few of these quickly now. but we're going to go into more detail regarding some of these perceptions later in the presentation. So in the first, for example, you can see here that limitations on access to other species, specifically tuna and blue line tilefish, where you can see circled, those components circled in red, was perceived to have increased or affected or increased effort on dolphin over time. Next slide. Shark abundance was especially highlighted in Wanchis as a factor that's limiting areas where commercial fishing can occur. Next slide. The regulatory levels and factors such as the price of dolphin and cost of entry, again circled in red, are perceived to influence entry into the fishery and ultimately be a factor on overall commercial effort on dolphin. And next slide, please. And from the participatory graphs, this is a summary of the results of the participatory graphs in Wanchis that illustrates that substantial shifts seem to have taken place in the species that commercial fishing businesses have depended on in the last 10 years. So in particular, you can note that there was a historical reliance on tilefishes, tunas, and sharks. However, if you look at the black arrows pointing towards that dolphin curve, or the dolphin line, which is the black line, you can see that Wanchis fishermen report that dependence on dolphin has now greatly increased in the summer. There's also been a shift in emphasis towards shrimp in the fall. Tuna, remains, which is that dark red line, it remains important as a commercial species in Wanchis throughout the year. Next slide. So, we can similarly break out the recreational portion of the conceptual model, combining first and second order linkages of those components, for all three workshops. Next slide. And on the recreational side, we can see that access to the coast and fishing grounds and changes in fishing power are perceived to have been major factors that have affected private recreational effort on dolphin, resulting in a perception of a significant increase in recreational effort over time. And that's a major theme that emerged from these workshops that we're going to talk about more below. We can also see that the value and use of species differs at the sub-regional level, with, for example, Wanchis emphasizing the importance of the local abundance of large dolphin for customer satisfaction, and Beaufort participants emphasizing the importance of access throughout the year as more important. This doesn't mean that those things aren't important. The other things aren't important, but these were things that were emphasized in those particular workshops. Next slide. And there are all, factors like strength of the economy, tuna and marlin fishing opportunities, and level of regulation that are perceived to affect effort on dolphin across all of the three subregions. Next slide. So similar to what we displayed for the commercial fisheries above, we've done a summary of the participatory graphs here for the three regions focusing on recreational fishing. And these illustrate that there's a high variation in seasonality across the subregions. So the black arrow, for example, shows that there's a high dependence on dolphin for recreational fisheries in Wanchis, in particular, over the summer. That's the one that really stands out, in the summer in Wanchis, but it's not the most important in the other two subregions. The green arrow points to the Wahoo curves, and you can see that Wahoo is important in the fall in all of the subregions. Next slide. So to provide a summary of the major findings from North Carolina and Virginia workshops, we found that there are subregional variations in access to the coast and the Gulf Stream in local demand for species and in shark populations, and that these can lead to local depletion of dolphin at small scales, even if the overall effort or catch, of dolphin has not increased. The recreational fishery, and especially the for-hire charter fishery, was described as more of a meat fishery, where it was important, for their clients and for customer satisfaction to be able to take home, larger amounts of fish. Charter demand is driven, primarily by tuna and dolphin. And there are concerns about accountability, particularly with recreational effort. And as I discussed at the beginning, there's overall relatively little discussion of Wahoo in these meetings. Next slide. So I'm going to now discuss the South Florida results, and then I'm going to end my part with a quick comparison of the North Carolina, Virginia results. So as I mentioned previously, in comparison to North Carolina, Virginia, there's a perception in South Florida and the Keys that dolphin abundance overall, and particularly the abundance of large-sized dolphins or gaffers, has declined significantly in the last 5 to 10 years. And our discussions with fishermen highlighted what we can call sort of competing hypotheses or different explanations regarding what may have been the major drivers of this change in local abundance. And so these include impacts on commercial landings and wider Atlantic stock abundance, regulatory issues, changes in migratory and distribution patterns, the increase in recreational catch, and biological factors that impact spawning and the survival rate of dolphin. So I should, it's not that these competing hypotheses are mutually exclusive. So some fishermen discussed a combination of these different hypotheses, but these were sort of the major hypotheses that kind of emerged from our discussions in South Florida. Next slide. So another thing, is that in South Florida, the model included much more discussion and speculation and information regarding the physical and biological drivers of local abundance than we had in North Carolina and Virginia. So in the model here, we can see that there are a wide range of physical biological factors that may be impacting local dolphin availability in South Florida, including things like changes in water quality and the position of the Gulf Stream. So, and fishermen also indicated some unique hypotheses regarding the biological impacts of depletion, but I'm not going to go into those here, but we can discuss those later if there's interest. Next slide. So the model also indicates that there is concern about the impacts of the changes in local abundance on the dolphin fishery overall and on the local recreational fishing economy, including things like increasing the charter search area, reducing a dolphin catch per trip, shifts in season length, and translating into fewer charter fishing opportunities, and effort shifts to other species. So there's concern about the impacts also on the overall reputation of South Florida as a good fishing destination if the mahi continues to decline as a viable target species. Next slide. Similar, so those previously mentioned impacts basically, have a downstream effect on the for-hire sector profits and on the local economy. Next slide. So for South Florida, the modeling effort highlighted a number of findings and possible issues that we need to take into consideration, and these include things like dolphin has become a symbol of South Florida with a very important economic role, and you can get paintings and shirts and posters, and you see mahi all throughout South Florida. So it's kind of an iconic species in this area, and that translates into marketing and other economic functions in the region beyond just its importance as a species to be fished. It seems that the effort and cost to catch dolphin is increasing, The number, power, and efficiency of private anglers is growing. Spearfishing is a major concern, particularly for wahoo. That was really the only, I think, concern that we heard about wahoo and fishing pressure on wahoo. And there were a lot of concerns expressed about international fisheries and international commercial fisheries. And, you know, one of the differences from, from the North Carolina workshops is there's really a very, very small commercial fishery, in South Florida. So the commercial fishery really isn't a big issue. It's really focused all on the recreational fisheries. But there is some concern that was expressed by South Florida fishermen regarding the loss of bag limit sales. I guess some 10 years ago, fishermen were able to sell their extra, bag limit from the trips to local restaurants and things, and that's been prohibited now. So there is some concern and discussion about that. Next slide. And then finally, in terms of some of the major differences between South Florida and North Carolina, Virginia that we found from this modeling effort, I think as we go through it, these are the things that we would highlight. There was definitely a bigger emphasis on physical biological drivers of dolphin distribution and local abundance in South Florida than there was in North Carolina and Virginia. There was a major concern about local and Atlantic-wide depletion. And this was, there was a concern about local depletion and the Atlantic-wide depletion, including the commercial fisheries that were outside of the region. And so there was definitely much more support in South Florida for stricter regulations on dolphin. As I just mentioned, this non-local commercial longlining was thought by many to impact the Atlantic-wide abundance. In South Florida, it's much more of a sports, leisure type of recreational fishery than a meat fishery. So fishing seems to be much more opportunistic. There are a lot more shorter trips, and big bag limits are not as much of a priority. Access to fish is more of a priority than bag limits. And there's less variation in the drivers of recreational effort in South Florida. Things like distance from shore and coastal development vary much less in South Florida than they do, up in the sort of that North Carolina, Virginia area. So now I'm going to turn this over to Mandy, and she's going to get into more detail about some hypotheses and questions.
Great, thanks, Matt. So hopefully you guys can all hear me okay. From Matt's presentation of the input that we've received from folks in the water, you might be starting to see some different patterns and questions emerging. And so the next step of this project is really to try and dig up some data and actually try and test some of the hypotheses. And so we identified 4 major hypotheses, issues that we felt were really worthy of addressing and things that could feasibly be addressed with data. The first question revolves around the role of the species in the fisheries and how that varies across the region. As Matt said, there's a lot of evidence that the use and the value of the species varies quite a lot across the regions. The second hypothesis is regarding this issue of, the real changes in dolphin that have been observed in South Florida in the last 5 years, and really trying to get a handle on what's going on here. The third hypothesis deals with economic forces that have caused an increase in commercial activity. And as Matt mentioned, there's concerns about depletion, both locally and the Atlantic-wide stock from these commercial activities. And then fourthly, the issue of the private recreational fleet and the sort of perception that the power and scope of the recreational fleet has expanded rapidly. So we'll go into this first hypothesis regarding the role of the species. And there were a couple different data sources that we used to get at this question. Firstly, we did a social media analysis, and I'll talk about what that is in just a second. And then we looked at the Marine Recreational Information Program, MRIP data. So we carried out this comprehensive social media analysis. And what we did is we started with a group of, a list of marinas or areas in both North Carolina and South Florida. And we searched for charter websites that, or charter companies that regularly post their catches either on social media or within their websites. And we did a full census of those charter companies that do regular posting. So taking all the photos and noting the dates of those photos from their websites and counting all of the catch from those photos. We focused on these dock or layout photos, the thinking that these are the best approximation of sort of the full day's catch. So in total, we counted almost 4,000 photos, and you can see the breakdown by region. The number of photos by region is listed there. Over 65,000 fish were counted, and these were from 39 species or species groups. And the photos go from 2017 to 2020, so more recent time series. This is a bar chart of the species species composition within those photos. So basically, again, each photo had a date, and we're looking at the time of year, the catch. So we've categorized the photos within 15-day windows or twice monthly windows. And then what you're looking at here in the colors is the proportion of catch for each of those 15-day windows. We've got South Florida on the left and North Carolina, Virginia on the right. And right away, just taking a glance at these plots, you can see there's some pretty striking differences. In South Florida, you see this is more of an opportunistic fishery with a lot more species diversity. So not particularly dominated by one or two species. You can see that dolphin and gray is caught year round, but it tends to dominate more in South Florida in June to October. You can also see that yellowtail snapper is the primary fallback species, and with king mackerel right behind that. And wahoo is the 12th most abundant. Again, this is the proportion of catch, and wahoo are quite difficult to catch and they have a small bag limit. So that explains why they're not so high in the terms of the proportion of catch. On the other hand, you look at North Carolina, Virginia, and you can see that really the catch is dominated by tunas from December to April, and then it shifts largely to dolphin from May through October. In this region, wahoo was the 5th most abundant in the catch. And then you see that king mackerel is more of a winter fishery as opposed to South Florida, where there's more of a spring fishery. So lots of differences in the species usage by region. We also pulled out the dolphin trips, those trips where dolphin were actually caught, and we're showing you here histograms of the number of dolphin per trip when the dolphins were present. North Carolina, Virginia on the top and South Florida on the bottom. And you can see that, as Matt said earlier, the North Carolina, Virginia fishery is more of a meat fishery, and it's emphasized the opportunity to catch fish is more important. And so naturally you see that the average number of fish caught, the average number of dolphin caught in North Carolina and Virginia is about twice that in South Florida. But we also see that the nature of these trips is really different. If you look at the MREP intercept survey data on the right, the average charter trip duration for a dolphin target trip in North Carolina is over 10 hours. And the average hour fish is 6.7 hours. And the vast majority, almost all of these trips are going far offshore. The Gulf Stream is further offshore. Whereas in Florida, we don't have the charter trip duration, it's not reported, but we do have the average hours fished, which is substantially less, 4.7 hours. And then over a 5th of these trips are actually staying relatively inshore. And again, Florida tourism seems to be more geared towards sort of a sport or leisure fishery. And charter captains, we're talking about, having a good day is 4 or 5 dolphin being caught. And so if you look at the nature of these trips, you can see there's economic incentives from the North Carolina, Virginia folks to, come back with more dolphin. They're making longer trips. These are more expensive trips, and they're going further offshore to get at the Gulf Stream. And so this creates, again, an economic incentive for more dolphin to be caught per trip. Okay, the second hypothesis that we're going to try and address with some data is this issue of why the dolphin populations have drastically changed in South Florida, or why they've perceived to be drastically changed in the last 5 years. And this is something that we heard very specifically in South Florida, really didn't hear in North Carolina. A fair number of fishermen thought that some of these changes were due to changes in the environment, which they had also observed. And so we wanted to look into that. And so we're going to look at some data from our South Atlantic Ecosystem Status Report, as well as some recent literature, some studies done on dolphin fish and sea surface temperature data. So again, the fishermen's observation that they had seen not only changes in dolphin, but also changes in the environment in the last 5 to 10 years really caught our attention in light of some of the indicators coming out of our South Atlantic Ecosystem Status Report. I'm showing 3 of those indicators here. What you're looking at is the indicators behavior over time. The vertical lines, you can see the dashed line is the mean of the indicator over the time series, and then the solid lines are the standard deviation. So you can see where the indicator is well above in green or well below the indicator average in red. And so, based on these 3 indicators, you can see that there have been some pretty substantial changes in the environment in the last 5 to 10 years. If you look at chlorophyll A, an indicator of primary productivity, you see that that's been below average for most of the last 5 years. You can look at the upwelling index. You see that starting in, there's been sort of a decline since 2013 or so. And you see that starting in 2015, some of those values are well under the average. And then if you look at bottom temperature, again, you see a lot of bouncing around, but starting in 2015, some substantial increases and a period of time where the indicator values are well over average. And this temperature is particularly interesting because dolphin, like other migratory species, they tend to have a range of temperatures that they prefer. And I want to point out this really nice paper that was done recently. This is a study by Leila Schlenker and her co-authors, where they actually put satellite tags on 19 gaffer, so the adult, large adult dolphin, and then track the movements of these fish over time. Now, these satellite tags give very detailed information on the movements and preferences of the fish. They're recording the temperature and the depth at which the fish are going every few minutes. And so you get these really nice results in terms of the temperature preferences of the species. And what you're seeing in this figure here, the results of this study, is that the temperature preferences are actually pretty narrow for dolphin. These fish actually are spending 95% of their time at temperatures between 25 and 29 degrees Celsius. And they actually split out the results for these different regions, the Gulf of Mexico, and then the southern, mid, and northern Gulf Stream. But you can see that regardless of the region, the dolphin really seem to prefer about 28 degrees Celsius. And, really there's few dolphin to no dolphin in some regions that are found outside of 30 degrees Celsius or 86 degrees Fahrenheit. And you put this line on the graph so you can kind of see that cutoff. So what I'm going to show you next is a series of sea surface temperature plots to look at how surface temperatures have changed across the region over time. So what you're going to see in an animation is monthly snapshots of sea surface temperature for the region on the bottom there. And then you see the legend on the upper right, which shows you the sea surface temperatures. And I'm going to block off in a thick black line this sort of cutoff at 30 degrees Celsius, so you can see where those areas are occurring. And then on the top, what you're going to see is average sea surface temperature for the year, for each of these years. And that's for these little rectangle in South Florida where you see the area. So the average is being calculated over this area around South Florida. So I'm going to let this animation fly, and you can see things kind of bumping up and down. There's a lot of variability. See some El Nino years coming through, some slightly warmer years in the late 90s. And then once we get to 2014, I've slowed it down here because we start to see some pretty substantial changes. And that gets us to 2020. So, once we get into the past 5 or 6 years, starting around 2014-15, you do see that the annual average sea surface temperatures are substantially higher. And this is a pretty big shift, almost a degree Celsius from before 2015 to after 2015. And you see on the bottom that, this translates to several months out of the year where a lot of the areas around South Florida are hitting that sort of 30 degrees Celsius threshold. So, this isn't necessarily conclusive by any means, but we do think that some of these shifts in the environment could explain why we are seeing such different perceptions or hearing such different perceptions from South Florida fishermen versus North Carolina, Virginia fishermen, that perhaps some of this environmental signal could be behind that explanation. And so this is definitely an area of research that we think warrants some further investigation. Okay, now we'll move into our third hypothesis, which was regarding the economic forces that have caused an increase in commercial activity and concerns about the impact of those commercial activities on local depletion and stock-wide depletion of dolphin. And we'll look at the NOAA foreign trade database, some commercial landings, again, our social media analysis and pelagic logbook data. First, I'm going to show you on the left here, we've got imports by region and then import values. And on the right, we're looking at US Atlantic landings and US values. And I'm going to walk you through a few trends that I think are notable here. First of all, let's look at the prices. We did hear from the fishermen the sentiment that increasing prices are driving, or that is an indication of increasing demand and increasing commercial activity on dolphin. And we see that indeed, the prices have increased over time. You can see very clearly in the import values, and these are inflation adjusted, almost a linear increase over time, a little drop off in more recent years. And you see the same pattern. It's a little bit noisier in the US values on the right, but you see if you look at the red, the South Atlantic, those prices have definitely increased over time. And now I want to draw your attention to the upper left graph, the imports by region. And here I've gotten things broken out by the total imports, which are in blue, and the Caribbean Sea to Brazil imports, which are in red. This is, the region that is thought to sort of be connected to the US South Atlantic in terms of migratory patterns. I want to note the blue lines are actually much greater than the red, and so note the difference in axis. The left axis in blue is corresponding to the blue lines, and then the red axis on the right is corresponding to the Caribbean Sea to Brazil imports. I've got those scaled differently because the all imports are much greater, and it would basically swamp out the signal that you see from the Caribbean Sea to Brazil in red. So the point I'm trying to make here is that the imports are really being driven by imports from the Pacific for the most part, not imports from the Atlantic stock. So those Pacific landings swamp out the Caribbean Sea and Brazil imports by a lot. The other thing I want to draw your attention to is that the US Atlantic landings and the Caribbean Sea Brazil imports are on the same scale in millions of pounds there. And it's kind of interesting to see that in some of the recent years, 2015, 16, 17, there is a pretty marked increase in imports, and those are being driven by imports from Brazil, Trinidad, sort of Eastern Caribbean countries. And, in a lot of years, they're actually well over the US Atlantic landings. And obviously the imports are just a minimum landings estimate. There is also local consumption, there's exports to other countries. And so, potentially the dolphin being extracted from the Caribbean Sea and Brazil region is potentially a lot more than the local US landings. And now I want to take us into the US landings a little bit more and look at some of the trends driving those changes. And so here on the upper left, we've got the total US Atlantic commercial dolphin landings by year. Again, one of the big concerns we heard was this increase of longlining activity and concerns that that was impacting the for-hire sector. We do see, an increase in commercial longlining over time. Going back to the 80s, there's an increase, although it seems to have sort of leveled off in recent years with the exception of some peak years. However, from the commercial standpoint as a whole, the commercial extractions have actually gone down over time. But again, the concerns we heard from fishermen were that, big concerns about an overall absence of large gaffers in South Florida and in North Carolina, particularly Wanchese. We heard concerns about commercial longlining impacting the presence of large gaffers in their summer season, when they're running out of those tunas and they're trying to put effort on dolphin and they're having trouble finding them because of competition with commercial longliners. And so if we go back to our social media analysis on the right here I've got the raw catch data, those trip catches from the photos plotted out over by the time of year. So the dots and X's are the raw photo counts, and then I've put some statistical smoothers over these so you can sort of see the seasonality And we've got Baylor, small Baylor dolphin in pink and large gaffer dolphin in blue. And you can see that what the fishermen are saying is absolutely true. You do have an overall absence of large gaffers in South Florida. The catch is dominated mostly by the Baylor size class. And then in North Carolina and Virginia, you do see, you know, this reduction in large gaffers being caught sort of midsummer. And if you look on the bottom left, this is the relative pelagic longline catch in the South Atlantic EEZ by month. And you do see that the large majority of the fish, the pelagic longlining activity, they're being caught in May and June. And so, there is some potential, we think, for local depletion. You have a lot of activity, a lot of pressure on the stock in this one time and place. They're coming through and getting hit by the recreational fisheries in May, and they're getting hit by the longline fisheries in May in this North Carolina area. So there is a potential for local depletion, even if the overall stock abundance is not being impacted. Okay, we're going to move on to our fourth and final hypothesis, which was regarding the power and scope of the private recreational fleet and how this is expanding rapidly. And we'll look at some ecosystem status report data and MRIP data. And one of the concerns that we heard from the fishermen, or the patterns we heard from the fishermen, were really that there's three major factors driving private recreational effort on dolphin and wahoo and other species. And that is, coastal development, which gets you the access to the coast. And then there's the human population growth and the number of humans in the area. And then the strong economy, which, gives each of those people spending power to, go fishing and get offshore. And this was a concern for folks in North Carolina in terms of where there's high access to the coast and a lot of population density. But these plots show very clearly why that concern is really exacerbated in South Florida. Simply, on the left, you can see we have high number of developed areas. If you look in the middle, there's a lot of large population density in that area. And then the strong economy, these plots are a little bit outdated, but, we've had a very strong economy with the exception of some impacts from COVID. But the economy has been growing, which gives, each person spending power. And so, a lot of the South Florida for fishermen, we're referring to this area sort of as the gauntlet because of the amount of fishing pressure that the fish are subject to. And so I think you can really see, why that pressure occurs through these plots here. And looking at, this is some of the data on the private recreational fleet. On the upper left, we've got recreational dolphin landings and wahoo landings stood out by for hire and private. And you can see that private does make up the majority of the landings for both of these species. On the bottom right, we look at the angler trips, which have increased over time as expected. But really, these data we feel don't capture all the concerns from the fishermen. The question is kind of for each of these angler trips, what is the actual power, the realized power of that trip? So the electronics have been really improving. People have been buying, more horsepower, more engines. They're able to get offshore. There's social media, transfer of knowledge. People's fishing locations get, broadcast. And so, really, the question is, what is the actual power of each of these angler trips? And so the perception of the fishermen was that recreational power has probably increased exponentially, even if the angler trips have only increased sort of linearly. And so we don't have a lot of data to capture those concerns. Okay, so we're going to try and wrap this up with conclusions and just go back through those four hypotheses and, what can we sort of conclude so far. So firstly, we talked about, again, the role of the fisheries and how they vary across the region. And, the interesting thing about the study is that what we've discovered is really there's personal values that differ across the regions. And so, a lot of the South Florida anglers tend to view the fishery more as a sport fishery, whereas in North Carolina and Virginia, it's much more of a meat fishery. And because, the values should drive the management objectives, it's going to be really difficult, we think, to find sort of a one-size-fits-all solution to make everyone happy. And so we think that management will probably need to consider the possibility for some measures to be taken at a sub-regional level because just the personal values surrounding these fisheries differ so much. In terms of our hypothesis 2, again, we looked at a potential environmental signal that might be driving some of the differences in perceptions between the South Florida and the North Carolina fisheries. And this environmental signal, if it is there, it has some implications for the efficacy of management. But also on the flip side, if we can better understand the environment and its role in local dolphin availability, then we could hopefully incorporate that information into management with some sort of dynamic management. So for example, if you know that the environment is going to give you a good year for dolphin and you know that ahead of time, then you could potentially increase the catch limits and allow everyone to take advantage of the additional dolphin availability. Whereas if you knew that the environment was going to give you a bad year for dolphin, then management could sort of proactively be precautionary and ensure that there's enough dolphin to go around for everyone in a limited year, and hopefully keep people in business during those difficult years. So this is definitely something we want to continue to explore. And then in regards to our third hypothesis, with the concerns about the increasing commercial activity, I think that the biggest point we want to make here is that there's sort of two separate issues that need to be pulled apart. So there's the issue of ensuring sustainable harvest, and then there's a separate issue which is addressing potential localized depletion and conflict. And the former issue with sustainable harvest is something that we really don't have a big handle on. As John mentioned at the beginning, this is a data limited species without a stock assessment, well, both Dolphin and Wahoo. The stock abundances are not necessarily under our control because a lot of the landings are coming from waters outside the United States. But a lot of the issues that we talked about today probably relate more to this localized depletion sort of issue, and these are under our control from a management perspective, but it's going to take a different set of tools. So just setting sustainable catch limits is not going to address the localized depletion. You really have to have greater attention to how the species are being used in time and space and trying to manage those conflicts. And then lastly, we heard that private recreational effort is sort of a pervasive concern, and I don't need to belabor this point. I think that the pictures probably speak a lot here, but this is an area where there were a lot of calls for increased accountability and data collection, so we have a better handle of what's going on in this sector. So that's it for the results, and just a quick slide on what our next steps are. We're going to be presenting parts of this to the June council meeting, and we're also going to deliver all the information, the conceptual models and a project report to the council. And as I mentioned, we want to continue investigating some of the environmental signals that we think might be there. Again, if we could predict dolphin availability, we might be able to incorporate this into management and have more flexible management tuned around the availability of the fisheries. And then with that, I just want to, we want to offer some acknowledgements. Again, thank you so much to all the fishermen and industry members who participated in these workshops for all their time and insights. Everything you saw today, all the insights and all the hypotheses that were tested, really, it all came out of the input that we received from the folks on the water. So we really appreciate everyone's time because, we really couldn't have done any of this without all that input. And just want to thank a few folks from the Science Center and the Council for some help on data analysis and their additional insights. Thanks for our funding sources, and also thank you to Dewey Hemmelwright for the idea of the social media analysis. That was really a great idea, and it gave us a lot of additional insights. And then finally, I know we're going to open for questions here online, but I know it's a beautiful day here in South Florida, and there's a lot of people out fishing, I'm guessing, and we really would like continued input from folks on the water. So if you're out fishing and you're just watching this recording, please feel free to contact us with questions outside the seminar. And thank you.